joins me now from United States, former U.S. ambassador to United Nations and former USAID administrator, Ambassador Samantha Power. Ambassador, welcome back to Program N1.
Good to be here.
Ambassador, we spoke 5 years ago in July about your life and your work and your experiences here. And I'm going to remind our viewership that you came here as a freelance journalist at age of 22 to start reporting about Bosnia and Herzegovina and what was going on at that time. And you said, and I quote you, "I wanted to close the gap between the world and as it is and the world as it should be. In Bosnia, the gap was a chasm. I felt I had to get closer to bear witness and to see if I could make even the smallest difference." You made that difference through your journalistic work and after that in government. But we are today at the 30th anniversary of genocide in Srebrenica. How that event impacted you and your colleagues who were working at the time here, and most of you were young and pretty unexperienced journalists at the time, and you made your lives and your careers and everything through those events?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that we were young, we believed that, especially after the end of the Cold War, that the sole superpower, because the United States, unlike today, was the sole superpower on the scene, that sole superpower would not allow something that evil to occur, you know, with the planes flying overhead and with the intelligence gathering that was going on. So we were reporters. We were reporting what we saw on the ground. Many of us were freelancers, not famous like Christian Amanpour, your other guest, but we were also connected to our country and to our government, and we were gravely disappointed and shocked. And so I think it's both the sort of mammoth scale of evil that was perpetrated against the men and boys and women of Srebrenica and against the people of Bosnia, but it was the shock and the scale of that massacre, I think, together that just left an indelible impression. And for me, it animated my desire to go into public service, to not be that reporter in the trenches, or in that case, I was in Sarajevo while the Srebrenica's men and boys were being massacred. I couldn't get out. We was encircled, as people who lived through the siege remember from that July. So we were all trapped, relying on UN officials to tell us what was happening, which was, as you can imagine, extremely unreliable. And meanwhile, the planes are flying overhead, and like the people of Srebrenica or those on their way to Tuzla, we hoped that they would do something to stop what was happening. But to be in that situation and to feel so useless, and to know that there were people in Western capitals, including in Washington, who did know what was happening, or at least knew a hell of a lot more than we did, definitely made me want to put myself in a position where I'd be reading the intelligence and trying to do something about what was happening on the ground. So my whole career path shifted with the opportunity I had to cover the fall of Srebrenica for the Washington Post as a freelancer at that time, and to recognize Bill Clinton. There's no question in my mind he was reading the Washington Post every morning. It was the hard copy of the newspaper back then, and yet Srebrenica happened. So I just thought, I'll never, at the height of my journalism career, I'll never be next to a story and a tragedy of this magnitude, perhaps, with an audience like this. And look what it achieved. It achieved exactly nothing. And so let me see if I can sort of change career paths. And so I ended up, as you mentioned, as a staffer at the White House and then UN ambassador. But most importantly, most recently, I was the head of USAID, and maybe the greatest privilege possibly of my life and my career was being USAID administrator and coming back to Bosnia a few years ago as part of the Biden administration, and seeing all these incredible Bosnians who chose to stay in the country, despite all of the odds against the economy, against long-term peace, despite all of the polarization. And they just stayed. And every day they woke up in the morning and said, what can we do to advance the cause of dignity, to advance the cause of the economy, to advance the cause of peace? And I got to work with those people in such a constructive way at such what remains a really difficult time for the people of that country. So, you know, my life went full circle to be in that position. And it goes without saying that it is absolutely devastating and horrifying that the United States has decided to suspend that incredible programming and that work, and above all, to lose the wisdom and the soul and the sacrifice of the USAID team members and those they worked with, who never gave up on building a better Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Madam Ambassador, you wrote on other place, and I quote you, the international response to Bosnia was grotesque spectacle of hand-wringing and indecision. The so-called leaders of the free world issued statements of condemnation while people were being slaughtered. He taught me a hard lesson about the limits of rhetoric and necessity of action. Christian Amanpour asked President Clinton in '94 about flip-flops of his administration and those indecisions about Bosnia, but also your later boss, President Biden, at that time, Senator Biden, was speaking and yelling and screaming inside Senate chamber about Bosnia and what needs to be done. But that action was not coming. And when I spoke with Ambassador David Sheffer, he told me, yeah, we were thinking about what to do, but we couldn't make a decision at the sit-room table. Was there any ability to prevent Srebrenica to happen, or it was just a mixture of different events which resulted in that genocide in Srebrenica?
You know, it's so easy from the present to look back on the past and say, yes, they could have just done this, this, and this. But I think in this case, there's a lot of evidence that that is true. The fact that the Dutch commanders on the ground called in requests for airstrikes to, you know, once the Dutch observation posts began to fall into Serb military hands, the UN commanders in Srebrenica were desperate for that support. Everybody remembers everybody in Bosnia at least remembers the dual key system, the NATO system, where the UN had to request and NATO had to agree. So that is, you know, a really important example. But you can even go back before that, you know, when the UN safe areas were created, you know, they were safe in name only. And the fact that food and basic well-being was denied to those people could have generated an action much further upstream, you know, not waiting for this attack to occur. And I guess the last thing I would say is nobody seems to have been more surprised than Mladic and the Bosnian Serb commanders on the ground that they were able to move into downtown Srebrenica like a knife through butter. Nobody seemed more surprised than them. I think they thought they would only be able to get away with an incursion, you know, taking maybe the bottom third of the so-called safe area, maybe building a buffer. And in fact, they sort of looked around and said, nobody's stopping us, because the Dutch on the ground, you know, ran from their positions, particularly after they realized they were not going to get any military support from NATO, from out. So that is just a few examples, I think, of things that might have been done, that even if they would not have saved every one of those innocent individuals who were executed or who were killed trying to escape Srebrenica, surely they could have saved some. And that is something all of us will have to live with forever.
Madam Ambassador, event which will be very much remembered about you here in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in the Western Balkans was a discussion about resolution on Srebrenica at the UN Security Council, which happened on July 8, 2015, so exactly a decade ago. And during that meeting, you said, Russia's veto is heartbreaking for the families of victims of Srebrenica genocide. is a further stain on a council's record, and it should be a new wake-up call to all of us to redouble our efforts to prevent further atrocities. But we know that the UNGA has adopted a new resolution last year about Srebrenica. Was that too late to get such a recognition of genocide in Srebrenica by United Nations?
First, let me just say that that was one of the lowest moments of my time at the United Nations representing the United States, was seeing my colleague Vitaly Churkin, who Bosnians remember as someone who was actually active in the peace process back in the early to mid-90s, who knew so well what had happened to the people of Srebrenica, who I think with me really wanted to find a way to get a resolution through the Security Council. But President Putin personally involved himself in reviewing the drafts that we negotiated together and personally decided to veto any resolution that made reference to the genocide. And that was, again, as shocking and horrifying, but also a predictor of the future. A future in which Putin would not only continue his invasion, of course, of Ukraine that was already underway, because he'd already invaded Crimea and eastern Ukraine at that time by 2015, but of course in 2022 to launch the full-scale invasion. And the Russian / now Serbian denial of facts and denial of truth. This is a tactic we saw play out in just the manner you described in the UN Security Council over Srebrenica, but then we saw it play out when Russian soldiers shot down that Malaysian about who was responsible and you know, very typical blaming of the victims or you know, blaming the witnesses. And of course, all of the lies about the invasion of Ukraine itself, small-scale military operation, blaming Ukraine for committing genocide when Russian forces were committing mass atrocities. So what we saw in 2015 really has been a preview of Russian actions, a predictor, I think, given that Russia backed Belgrade and even, you know, with some officials, even I would say, pushed Belgrade to even be more nationalistic and more of historical deniers than certain individuals might have been inclined to be. There were plenty in Serbia who wanted to go in that direction, of course. But knowing the nationalists that they had Russian backing has emboldened them around the world and emboldened them within Serbia, of course, to move in a very different direction, in spite of the International Court of Justice opinions, in spite of the convictions of Bosnian Serb and Serbian officials at the ICTY. So I think what you saw, we have an expression in English, which is a canary in a coal mine, where the canary goes into the coal mine and comes out covered with coal, and you know what's going on in the coal mine. I think that veto of that resolution, that really was a predictor of what would be the next decade of Putin's approach, what would increasingly become the approach of senior officials in Belgrade. And I'm very sad to say what is increasingly becoming the approach of many senior U.S. officials, which I did not see coming, that, you know, there could be debates and, you know, not only around historical events in the Balkans, but historical events in my own country, where our textbooks are being purged, where there's efforts afoot to take out of our textbooks any negative history and tell only a happy story of America's evolution. So I'm sad to say that it feels like the playbook of genocide denial and historical denial is one that is being embraced now in very prominent quarters, including, unfortunately, in many quarters in Washington. To your question, if I may, just come back to the General Assembly resolution last year, I think that's very important. I think it's really important that the General Assembly got on record also speaking out against genocide denial, not just on behalf of the facts of what happened in July of 1995. But, you know, that was in these very divided times at the United Nations, it was a good show that so many countries were willing to come together. And the one thing every citizen of Bosnia and Herzegovina should know, and actually every citizen of Republika Srpska should know, some of whom celebrated the fact that there were no votes in opposition to that resolution, what you should know is the amount of pressure that the Russian Federation and Serbia likely placed on UN ambassadors and on UN member states, possibly with the help of China and other powerful countries that I don't know because I'm not in New York. But for that number of yes votes to come together and support the truth in 2024, 2025, anything that happens these days with lopsided margins like that means that the truth has sunk in. And the victims and the survivors and the people who are horrified by all of this denial can take some solace in that fact that you have court decisions, you have history textbooks across Europe, you have commemorations going on all across the United States this year, 30 years later, and you have those UN documents and those UN resolutions that affirm what we all know to be true.
Madam Ambassador, let me ask you as professor, as a scientist, as someone who teaches and who researches genocide in Srebrenica Potocaj Memorial exactly 10 years ago on July 11th, you said the evil that was done here must be called by its name. It was genocide. You just spoke a bit about denial, but what the denial could do to young generations here if we have President Vučić, President Dodik, government officials, other officials who are openly congratulating birthdays to Radovan Karadzic or welcoming Šljivančanin to Belgrade or calling Mladić hero, or in Croatia accepting Blaškić and others as quote-unquote heroes. What that can do to young generations, and in which direction can push them if we don't counter that in the right way?
It has to be countered. And the hardest thing that all of us are grappling with, regardless of whether it's an issue as grave and essential as this or other issues of politics and history, what we're all struggling with is how hard it is these days to change anybody's mind. What we're all struggling with is the information ecosystem that especially young people, but people of all generations are falling into, that has them hearing lies, nothing but lies, that has them hearing lies accompanied by fear-mongering. So it's not just that this didn't happen, it's also that the Bosniaks or the Muslims did it and they killed this number of people and they're a risk, and they were a risk then and a threat then, and now they're a threat now. And that lays a foundation not only for a lack of understanding of history, but a receptiveness to really dangerous politicians and demagogues who want to do crazy things, like secede or arm or, prepare, for a conflict or even incite a conflict. And, all around the world, things like this are happening. We just had a political assassination occur of a Minnesota lawmaker, who's only, who all she had done was basically say she was going to attend a protest in opposition to President Trump. And that convinced somebody who's in one of these information echo chambers that she was such a threat to the president that she and her husband had to be assassinated. I mean, so this is happening everywhere. I will say, but the people of Bosnia and Herzegovina and even the people of Republika Srpska are in a different situation than we are in, a much more difficult one in some ways, but you at least have the memory of how lies can become war. You have that memory. And it's something that every parent and grandparent has to talk to their kids and their grandkids about how dangerous these lies are. And not just, the war that began in 1992, but even the Second World War and how neighbors were turned on neighbors. There's a lot of history to point to, but it is extremely worrying. And the fact that people are not getting access to independent news and independent facts or independent textbooks in the schools, does create a risk of a cycle of hate and mistrust. And this is another reason that I am heartbroken at President Trump's decision to destroy the U.S. Agency for International Development, because one of the things USAID supported over the last 3 decades was independent journalism, independent investigations, investigations not tied to any political party, with no American agenda behind them, just looking at the fact that the Bosnian market, the free market, could not yet support independent investigations into corruption or into school policy or into the environment. Those investigations just weren't getting funded on their own. So with the European Union offering just some financial support with no editorial say whatsoever, and now that independent journalism, as you well know, is in great jeopardy. And it's going to be extremely important in this period where the United States has taken itself off the field for other actors to step up and to support those journalists who are often risking their lives in order to do this kind of work. So that is what's going to make a difference ultimately in continuing to get facts out there that can reach young people and journalists. Of course, all people who have a message to communicate have to be more sophisticated, more TikTok savvy, better able to reach young people where they are, and not in, big history books like I write, or even probably shows like you host. Somehow we have to meet young people on the platforms where they're taking in their news and their facts.
Madam Ambassador, you mentioned the media, and I can't miss to ask you, President Trump is taking action against RFE and Voice of America. Is that opening more space to voices such as RT and others with agenda about simple to what you just described, to get even more influence here in the Western Balkans, especially with the projects who are supported by governments such as Serbia and Republika Srpska, to influence media sphere here in the region of Western Balkans?
It is, in football, you have the expression, the own goal. It will go down as one of the biggest own goals in American history. We are at a stage and at a crossroads, given the rise of the People's Republic of China and given Russia's billion-dollar investments in media and messaging. We were at a stage before President Trump came where we needed to substantially increase our investments in support for independent media of the kind I described that USAID was doing, but also investments in media outlets like Radio Free Europe and, of course, like Voice of America. Instead, to shut down those outlets at the very time that China and Russia are increasing their investments, I've heard it described as soft power suicide, but it's more than that. Again, back to the exchange we had before, when lies become facts and in people's minds, in young people's minds, when lies also have the potential to incite violence, to not have any counteracting messaging at scale is just extremely dangerous. I mean, we would never have said, okay, Joseph Goebbels, go ahead, you send your message out. We would not want President Xi to have his message on a platform of his own without any competing reporting, without people on the ground with their notebooks, with their pencils, with their fact checking. It is extremely important, the work that has been done over these decades, and it is an absolutely devastating blow to truth, to democracy, but also to stability. Devastating.
Another issue at the moment on a global stage is Gaza, and that's a part of war crimes and what's going on the ground. Your administration was not successful to finish that. President Trump administration neither, although he was promising that he will end up that in 24 hours. Is this another example of inability of international community to stop the war when it was supposed to end without too many, and each victim is too many, but without too many victims?
Well, clearly it is an inability. And the fact that you have tens of thousands of Gazans who have been killed, the fact that you have all the Israelis who were killed on October 7th and still hostages in Hamas custody, the fact that the Israeli government has used food now as a weapon of negotiation, as a weapon of war, effectively, holding it back, and basically saying you're not getting any food until that is not something that a government should do. And it's extremely important that the United States be pressing Israel to allow food and medicine and water to reach the people of Gaza, the vast majority of whom had nothing to do with the events of October 7th. I think the diplomacy is essential, but it's and this was true in the Biden administration as well. You have to couple diplomacy with incentives and disincentives, with carrots and sticks. And that, the fact that that really has not happened in American foreign policy over these last years is a factor in why this war is continuing. And when we were at USAID, I can't tell you, we worked 24/7 to just try to get as much food and medicine and as much of a break from the bombing, as many ceasefires or humanitarian pauses during the day as we could get. But fundamentally, until the war ends, the hostages will not be reunited with their family, and the people of Gaza will never be able to walk free in the street or live lives, with physical security and with any form of dignity. And the terror that they are experiencing every day is unimaginable.
Madam Ambassador, thank you so very much for your time and for this very timely conversation.
Thank you.